Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our third Impact Call of 2018, reporting out on our second quarter results. Today, we're going to dive into both our financial and overall results that we've had. And we're going to start by just doing a little bit of housekeeping here. So, Holly, you want to go ahead and go to the next slide?
Absolutely. Here we go.
Great. So two things before we get started. The first is that today's webinar will be interactive. And so please feel free to ask questions throughout today. And you can do that using the questions pane on the GoToWebinar interface. And so that's present throughout the webinar. We're going to try to save 5 to 10 minutes at the end of the webinar today for questions. The second is that we're recording the webinar. And we'll make sure that that goes out to everybody via an email either this afternoon or tomorrow when we're done. So with that, let me introduce myself and my colleagues who are here today. I am Gabe Cohen. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing and Communications here at GuideStar. With me in the room in DC is Mizmoon Kusairi. She's our Vice President of Strategy and Finance. And then joining us for the first time on the Impact Call is Holly Ivell. And she's our Director of Data Services and is calling in from North Carolina. With that, let me go over the agenda for today, and then I'll turn it over to Holly. So I'm going to start by talking just a little bit, doing a brief overview of who GuideStar is. If you're on this call, you probably already know, but I'll just do a quick refresh and then talk about an impact call and what its purpose is. Then I'm going to turn it over to Holly, who's going to talk about, really do a deep dive into our data. And then she'll turn it over to Miz, who's going to talk about our recent results. And then we'll do a quick lesson learned, and then ending with questions. So with that, let's go ahead and let me talk a little bit about GuideStar. So if you're not familiar, GuideStar exists to help people make better decisions about nonprofits and the work that they do. We believe that better nonprofit data leads to better decisions, which will lead to a better world. And that's why our tagline is better data, better decisions, better world. We've tried to synthesize it down with just that one tagline there. So Holly, if you want to jump ahead 2 slides, I want to talk a little bit about how we work. And with that, we use this diagram that goes from left to right, starts with inputs or data sources. And then in the center, that's us, that's GuideStar, we're a data hub. And that information gets out to the world via 2 different sets of channels that I'll talk about in a second. And that information ends with our users. So just to put some numbers to this, Holly, if you just want to click one more time, we have information on 2.7 million nonprofits. And now that includes both present day and historic organizations. And then that information gets out via us, via the hub, via 2 different channels. The first channel on the top there, in the green circle, is our website. And last year we had about 9 million users come to GuideStar to look at information on nonprofit organizations. But not only does the information live there, but it also goes out to a partner network of about 200 to 220 different platforms that are powered by our data, that take that information that lives in GuideStar and shares it with their users. And so we know that that's kind of 10 to 20 million, and we think that it's even more than that as well. So with that, let me just explain a little bit what an impact call is on this next slide. And the whole idea for the impact call is born out of the idea of a for-profit company's quarterly earnings calls. Really, we want to provide more real-time results to you all, to our constituents and our stakeholders in an interactive format that encourages a dialogue. We think that it's kind of like an annual report, but a little bit more frequent, and then it also has that interactive nature to it. So with that, Holly, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you so you can dive into the data a bit more.
Great. Thanks very much, Gabe. I appreciate that. So the heading for this section is what's new, what's coming soon. In some ways, this isn't new, but there are some elements here that we think are going to be exciting to talk about and walk through. And so we're going to dive right in. We often talk about 3.7 billion pieces of data, that growing number that GuideStar highlights as being the core of our repository. And it's a big number, and sometimes we get the question, so what? What does that mean? And so we're going to take a little bit of time here to talk about how the Data Services Group, which is my organization, has been working on a project to give some of that data more dimension and to help provide different stakeholders with more insights that make that data come to life. So I mentioned my team, and I think that's perhaps another thing that is new to some folks. Many of the activities that Data Services provides have been around for some time, but we have grouped these together into a Data Services organization over the last year or so. So the team really is subject matter experts in the data that we have in our repository. We have access to data in the repository that goes beyond, in many cases, what's available on the website. We don't naturally want to provide every data element in a 990 filing on a website page, but the repository that we have has a lot of components that many people are interested in, and we can develop custom data sets and reports for specialized purposes. And those purposes cover a pretty broad range. Sometimes we have folks who approach us with a one-time need. There may be trying to get a better understanding of the sectors through some landscape analysis kinds of views of data or data over time. They may be looking to do some verification. So some organizations may have been working with nonprofits over an extended period of time and need to verify that they've got the latest information about that organization or what the status is. We also do kind of targeted research. So sometimes an organization is looking to understand deeply a particular pattern or part of the sector. We also work very regularly with some of those DDN partners around managed data services. So those are ongoing data feeds that really support information exchange that is ongoing. Another thing that I'll highlight is we've been working to build out some data sets for educational organizations and researchers. So that's taking shape as our research fundamentals data sets. And then many people have used over the years our compensation report, and that's underneath the data services heading as well. We regularly get inquiries from the media who are trying to research and understand charities that are in their particular geographic region. And so we work with those inquiries to help people to interpret 990s and to educate them on some of the aspects of the 990 that can be helpful as they're telling a story or asking questions and looking at charities in their area. So that's a little bit of a highlight. And now what I'm going to do is just take a moment to show you an effort that we've had underway, a dashboarding effort that we're building in data services to help stakeholders internally have better and deeper conversations with many of our clients. So like any good dashboard, we always start with a summary page, and this summary page is packed with lots of information. So I'm just going to highlight a few pieces to give you a flavor of how that 3 billion pieces of data really begins to take shape. The first thing is starting over in the left-hand side is this overview. And really this is a way to talk about both the historic and the active organizations that we have in our database. 2.7 million nonprofits that we track information about. And of those, about 1.7 million are currently registered with the IRS. So we have both history on organizations that are perhaps no longer functioning, but that have an important role in terms of tracking trends or information about the sector, as well as the organizations that are currently registered. One other thing we do is we work with organizations that do not appear on the BMF for a number of reasons, churches primarily and government instruments, to add those organizations through a vetting process into our database. And so today we have about 12,000 of those organizations. The other thing that we're trying to begin to give more of a picture of is how the sector is moving and changing and growing over time. And so this is a picture of the volume of new organizations that are either coming through the IRS BMF file or coming through our vetting process over time. So you can see looks like over the last 6-7 months, we've had roughly 60,000 new organizations that have come into our environment that we can report on and share information about. The right-hand side starts to drill into some of the additional details about those active organizations. And so you can begin to get a picture of the types of charities that types of nonprofits that we're talking about. Most people think of nonprofits as public charities, 501c3, public charities, private foundations also fall in here. And then there's a whole swath of organizations that are also tax exempt that we maintain a fair amount of information on, and that can be very interesting. To the right, we've got some other views to help us begin to tease out and get a sense of the type of information we might have about those organizations, both by revenue and by filing requirements, which we'll touch on in a little more detail in just a moment. One thing that I'd love to highlight, a lot of times people ask about religious houses of worship, churches, are they in the database? There's actually almost 250,000 of that 1.7 active orgs that are religious houses of worship. They're coded with a 10 in the BMF filing that are active and in our database. Many of them are not required to file an annual return, but we do have a listing. So it's kind of an interesting point. So I'm just going to transition and talk very briefly about filing. So people know about the high-level information that may be available about an organization, but it can be really compelling to look at an organization over time. And so this begins to paint a picture of the volume of filings that we have. On the left-hand side, we're looking at 2009 to 2017, and that almost in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% of the insights that we have are actually coming from paper filings. So while we are increasingly seeing more e-filings in the space, a lot of our repository things that we have digitized are coming from those paper filings still. And the other piece that's interesting to note is just how quickly data is moving into the system. I know when we see something that's 2017, you think, well, we're in 2018, but based on how the filing structures work with the IRS, we're actually moving very quickly in loading information about organizations fiscal year 2017. We have almost a third of filings that we would expect, for instance, for 990s already. One of the other things that, we talk about the term 990 or EZ or PF, and these are all IRS annual filing forms. And we're trying to really help people understand, well, what types of data can you glean from those forms? And that somewhat depends on the size of the organization and the type of filing they're doing. So I'll highlight just a couple of examples here. Larger organizations fill out a 990. And for those filings, we can often get information about the number of employees, the number of volunteers, for instance, where the EZ filing does not contain those particular details. Another kind of nuance that can be really important is what's the level of detail we have on the financial side. So for instance, in a full 990, there's over 30 expense categories. And we can drill in and look at those in great detail. And on an EZ form, which is a smaller sized organization, those expense categories are broken down into 7 groupings. And so there can be some real nuances between the data sets depending on the type of organization you're interested in and the type of filing that they do every year. So I'm going to shift now and just give you another layer down. We saw on the summary page some information about the number of organizations by subsector type. And here you can begin to get a picture of the organizations across, oops, sorry, I don't know if you all can see this, but I hit a button that just overlaid my page. So I'm back. So we often talk about the range of organizations by revenue or by annual expense. And so this view really helps bring home to us that we have a lot of organizations, more than half, that are either $50,000 or less, or are so new or are not required to file that we really don't have reported revenue information. But everything from the column C to the right begins to paint a picture of the size of the organizations in the nonprofit sector across these different subsection dimensions. And we also took some time to pull out private foundations because we often think about those from an asset perspective. One other fun way we're trying to begin to think about, well, how do we create some visual pictures that can be very quickly insightful? And so our first pass at this is really looking at counts of organizations by NTEE categories and codes. And so you can see in the upper right-hand side that human services, which is a collection of different related NTEE categories, makes up the largest group of organizations based on a count. We would see probably a very different stacking of size if we looked at these organizations based on expense or assets. We know, for instance, that hospital types, healthcare types of organizations or educational organizations tend to be much larger in size, where human services organizations are smaller. But a first pass, just trying to say, well, how many are in the field and can we group them? And then from there, maybe we can begin to explore, well, within that human services space, what is that made of, right? And it's made of a pretty wide range of things, but we can come down and, for instance, out of here, pick an NTE code that starts with an N and just take a look at that space. So now we're looking at recreation, sports, and leisure, and that's the third largest grouping by NTE code. So that's very interesting. I'm sure some of you have already noticed this unclassified box. That really makes up two categories. One is organizations that are either filing a 990N, so they're really those very small nascent organizations making $50,000 or less, which in many cases means that they're fairly new, or they're organizations not required to file. And so, but if we wanted to just see what makes up that recreational and sports category, we can now begin to drive into some of those views and talk with people about the different types of activities, the different types of organizations that we can share information on in a much more granular way. So maybe we want to know about baseball organizations and how many of those there are and how many of those there are by size. And maybe we want to know about professional athletic sports. Folks are always surprised to find that that's part of the sector as well, and what the makeup is and how they break out across revenue or expense. The last view that I'll share is really our beginning attempt to begin to toggle back and forth and look at how the sector take shape across the country geographically. So we can look at a density of nonprofits across the country broadly. We can drill into a particular category and get a picture of how education cascades across the country as educational organizations, or we could pick a state and then see what the makeup of those organizations are in that state, which can be really fun to just explore and begin to see how different states, their nonprofit sector is shaped. And again, these initial views are all based on counts. And so we're excited to begin thinking about what are some of the other ways we might cut this data. I think we would see some different patterns if we were looking at it by revenue or looking at it perhaps by age of organization, which is sometimes a challenging thing to get at. But this is really just the beginning of some work that the team is doing that we thought you all might find interesting, and that we would tee up today and perhaps have a little bit of time for questions at the end about. So with that, I think I'm going to pass this over to you, Ms.
Great. Thanks so much, Holly. That was really fascinating. A lot of great insights and great visualizations as well. I'll just invite everyone, as all that information is sinking in for you, please chime in, put in your questions in the question box. I know Holly will be really excited to dig into those at the end of the call. So with that, I'm going to switch over to our internal dashboard. So how do we think about our work and our performance as an organization? You see here our theory of change, and we are always making sure that it reflects our current performance and activities. And as you can see, if you read this left to right, our activities there are grouped around our data, which Holly just went into great detail about, the tools that we offer to nonprofits and others using our website, and the reach, how far and wide that information goes. And all of that combined with the activities of other infrastructure organizations in the field, we are just one of many, leads to those user outcomes that you see in the middle column, and eventually into field level outcomes that you see in the last column in yellow, which is more and smarter giving by donors, as well as less waste and higher performance by nonprofits. And this theory of change really guides our work, and as well as how we monitor our performance. On the next slide, I will dive into our data. And so that 3.7 billion, as you see there, which Holly cited and went into great detail about, the number of data points that we have is continuing to grow year on year and quarter on quarter. And on the right, we've talked about this on past impact calls, if you've been on. This is the information at various levels that nonprofits provide to us. So at the most basic level, operational data, moving up to financial data, as well as qualitative and quantitative program data. So that allows nonprofits to share even more information about the work that they're doing, so that individual donors, foundations, others who are wanting to learn about nonprofits can understand a nonprofit's performance better. And our platinum seals have grown tremendously, nearly 20% quarter on quarter and over 100% year on year. And that's the quantitative program metrics that I had just mentioned. We've been seeing a lot of increased functionality in that, as well as some new promotions that our teams here have been working on, which have increased that level of profile adoption. On the next slide here, I'll dig into our tools and resources. On the left, you see our monthly active users. And, this particular performance on our website, we've been tinkering around and figuring out what is the best metric to track this performance. We used monthly active users last year. We started moving to core users this year, but it's been quite tricky for us. And so we're moving back to monthly active users. Kind of the information that we have and the calculations have been inconsistent on that core user metric. And so we're moving back to monthly active users, and you'll see it's about 70% last quarter, the percent of paying users that are on our site on a monthly basis. On the right, you will see profile views and number of searches. So profile views in blue, you'll see that continues to grow over time. A lot of folks out there have been creating fundraisers on Facebook, and the recent Raíces fundraiser that went viral has really contributed to that increasing number of profile views on our website. You'll see in orange that chart line has gone down. We generally have less activity, kind of folks going into summer and the vacation months. So that's not to be unexpected. It's similar to the levels that we had this time last year. On the next slide, I will talk through our reach. So on the left, you see the number of registered users, as well as our unique users, which continues to grow quarter on quarter, as well as year on year. And then on the right, if you recall the data hub chart that Gabe first talked about, these are the number of other organizations and companies and websites that sharing GuideStar data. So Facebook, as I mentioned, is one of them. The growing number of different platform customers and data distribution network is how we refer to it internally. This is really growing as a result of some new API products that we have, as well as our local and national directory clients. On the next slide, shifting gears a bit to talk about our financial performance. If you read this chart left to right, you'll see that our revenues and expenses is also meeting our budget targets. So we're essentially on target as of Q2 2018, resulting in a change in unrestricted net assets of about $400,000, which is close to what we had budgeted. So essentially, we're meeting our performance targets from a financial basis through the year. And then on the last slide in this financial section, you'll see our balance sheet information. Our balance sheet is also kind of holding steady through the year. The one point of difference has been our lower cash levels. And this is as a result of differences in our accounts receivable as well as our account payable levels, but it's still at the healthy, $1.8 million level. With that, I will turn it back to Holly.
Great. Thanks, Ms. So we always try to share at least one lesson learned in these calls. And since I mentioned that the Stata dashboard is something new that the team is prototyping and beginning to build out, one of the things that we have been iterating on is really trying to strike a balance between getting into the nuances and the technical details when presenting data to help it be really accurate and precise, with making the information intuitive and useful so that we can have meaningful conversations with stakeholders who have perhaps widely differing interests and understandings of the field. And so this is an area that we're constantly talking about and trying to think about how to refine. Would welcome any comments or thoughts on that as well.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you, Holly, and I appreciate the deep dive into that section. And apologies if we're having any audio issues out there to our audience today. We just have a few minutes left for questions. If anybody else wants to ask a question, again, go right ahead and do that using the questions pane there in the GoToWebinar interface. Holly, I want to ask you a question to start, and that is, as you peel back this onion, what have you been most surprised about? What are the kind of data points or slices that you've taken that you've really been surprised about personally?
I think for me, I came from an organization prior to coming to GuideStar that was very focused on the 501c3 sector for charitable giving, and it was a really big aha and very interesting to realize that there are many other categories of nonprofits and just how diverse the sector is. In the types of work it's doing across the country and the ways that is addressing social needs. So that to me was fascinating and continues to be.
Great. We have another question here about, if we talked about our data distribution network, these partners that have platforms that are powered by our information. Holly, do you want to talk a little bit about what are some of the ways that this information can flow from our data hub into these different applications? I know we've mentioned APIs earlier, but do you want to just dive into a little bit of detail around that?
Sure. Yeah, we have a very wide range of ways that we approach our partners who are interested in leveraging this data on their platforms. And in some cases, the API is exactly the right solution. And in other cases, an organization is maybe looking for an aggregate or an incremental feed of data on some cadence. And so we have different ways to extract the data and deliver it. So it can be delivered through a CSV or an FTP service, right? Different file standards are possible and different delivery standards are possible. And so we have some folks who look for weekly feeds, some folks who are looking to refresh their environment monthly or quarterly. So we have a lot of flexibility in how we can approach those platform integrations.
Excellent. Thanks, Holly. And with that, we are pretty much at time today. So we had a few other questions that we weren't able to get to. If we weren't able to get to your question, we will make sure to follow up with you individually. But thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we look forward to chatting with you in just a few months for our fourth quarter impact call. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks.